Hello, I want to welcome everybody. I'm Rich Pirog. I'm the director for the Center for Regional Food Systems at Michigan State University, and I'm a member of the National Racial Equity in the Food System Committee. I want to welcome you all to this national webinar, Building Relationships Across Higher Education Institutions to Address Racism in the Food System. This webinar is sponsored by the Racial Equity in the Food System Work Group, a national committee and work group in coordination with the Center for Regional Food Systems here at MSU. Our Center for Regional Food Systems has over the past several years developed several national resources that are used by food system educators, researchers, and advocates who are interested in work at the intersection of racial equity and food system. The newest of these resources, the one in the middle, 8th edition of the annotated bibliography on structural racism in the US food system, has over 100 new citations and videos, and can be loaded into a citation management software called Zotero. You can do this right on the website that shows you how. So if you're writing a newsletter article or any kind of communication channel, you can, and you're focusing on writing on the intersection of structural racism, racial equity, other issues related to that, you can use this tool. So as I said, this is sponsored by the Racial Equity in the Food System Work Group. You're looking at the steering committee members as of February of 2021. This group is a community of extension professionals and community stakeholders who have been connecting, learning, and collaborating to facilitating change within our institutions and society to build racial equity within the food system. This webinar marks the 10th national webinar since 2018. So we've been doing this for about 3 years, that the Racial Equity and Food Systems Committee, or REFS committee, have done. Committee members are very active in their own states and in other multi-state collaborations regarding issues of racial equity, inclusion, food sovereignty, food justice. And although our webinars attract a wide range of food system and health practitioners and nonprofits and colleges and local, state, and federal government agencies, a primary audience that we do seek to influence our land grant system and other higher education educators and researchers. And as this REFS committee continues its journey, we've come to realize the importance of better understanding and fully representing the diverse voices of these land grant system and higher education food system educators and researchers. As you can see here, we're a racially diverse committee. However, the majority of our members are from 1862 or white-led land grant institutions. And this webinar is part of our journey at REFS, and hopefully part of your journey to learn more altogether with you, with us, with our panel about 1890 and 1994 land grant institutions, as well as what have been referred to by USDA, our Hispanic Serving Ag Institutions, or Hispanic Serving Ag Colleges and Universities. You know, the committee at REFS knows that we have to move at the speed of trust to build relationships that are authentic, that are not exploitive, and that share power and resources to be able to do this work and work across these institutions. And those of us that are at 1862 land grant institutions, such as myself, we have a lot to learn about historical and current disparity, as well as the assets that BIPOC-focused higher education institutions, like the ones you're going to hear from in this particular panel, have to offer, and also the potential they can provide if we all can work together to just influence a more equitable resource distribution and access strategy. And part of that is about listening and understanding. So that's part of our story here. Before we go on to actually hear from our panelists, and we do have 2 poll questions. So I'm going to introduce the first question here. You're looking at a slide of it as well. It should show up in your box there. In the next 5 years, what level of progress do you expect your organization to make in reaching racial equity goals in the next 5 years? Okay, we can see that some progress, about 50% of you responded some progress, and about a third responded significant progress. And less than 15% said little to no progress or did not know. So we're going to move on to our second poll question. So here's our second question. Select the option that best describes your level of understanding of what a Hispanic serving agricultural college or university is and why it has that designation. Select the option that best describes your level of understanding of what a Hispanic serving agricultural college or university is and why it has that designation. We can see here that over 60% had little to no understanding about a Hispanic serving agriculture college or university. That will be, I think, useful information for Alex as he shares his own insights later. Only a third had some understanding, 5% a deep level, and there's a few individuals that currently work at a Hispanic serving ag college, university, or a Hispanic serving institution. So thank you for giving us that feedback. It will, again, inform both our panelists here today. We're going to now move on. We're going to end the polls, and we're going to move on. And it's my privilege and honor here to introduce a colleague and a friend, Renee Wallace with Doer's Edge Consulting, who is going to be our moderator and facilitator with our panelists. Welcome, Renee.
Welcome, and thank you for that introduction, Rich, and good day, everyone. Glad that you're here with us today. My role today is to guide us through the conversation, which will be initiated with remarks from each of our panelists, followed by a discussion among the panelists, and then concluding with a Q&A that responds to your reflections and your questions. So we encourage you along the way to use the question answer feature to put questions in, and we'll answer those along the way. Before I introduce the panelists, I'd like to just share 3 thoughts as thought starters to kick off our conversation today. Oftentimes when you come to these particular types of conversations, most of the light is given primarily to the facts that historical disparities exist. In today's discussion, you're also going to focus on and give light to the impacts of the disparities, and to talk about how our presenters today in their institutions are succeeding in the midst of those. They'll talk about how the disparities impact capacity to deliver academic and community services, what the impact is on the experiences of employees and students and their life at the institutions, what impacts are novel to the different types of institutions, and which are more systemic and happen to across all of them. We'll also take a look at how this affects the community's abilities to care for themselves, because land grant institutions being part of an effort on economic development, how does the access or disparity in resources impact the people served in the communities? Secondly, one of the things we felt was important to do was to shift the conversation and away from more of a deficit perspective, but to take a look and learn from our presenters today about the asset-based approaches that they're taking to their work, and sharing with us, what does that look like? We'll explore the value side of this work and how the institutions are accomplishing much, even being resource constrained, and imagining and exploring how much more they could accomplish with more equitable funding. So when we look at the results as well, the equity in the results, and how they're actually reaching high percentages and similar percentages as other institutions in their impact, even though they are more resource constrained. And the biggest question of all is, how do we stop looking at these institutions from a deficit model and begin to look at them as the assets that they are, and seeing them as rich places that are able to do much in spite of being under-resourced. And last but not least, obviously, we're going to lean into this hard conversation about the relationship between white supremacy and racism and the impact on the food system, and how institutions like those you'll hear from today are building relationships to address those disparities. So at this time, I'm going to take a few minutes and introduce you to our amazing panelists today. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they're going to speak. They'll each have about 10 minutes, and we'll cue them along the way to let them know when we're moving. So we'll move from panelist to panelist. First, I'll introduce you to Dr. Lindsay Lunsford, and she's going to speak to us from the perspective of 1890 land grants, which are historically Black college and universities. Dr. Lindsay Lunsford, she is a scholar, activist, and agriculture activist. She's been inspired by her alma mater, Tuskegee University, in setting the tone for upcoming generations of rural and urban agriculturalists. Sorry. She's a recent graduate of Tuskegee University's Integrative Policy and Development doctoral program. Congratulations to her again. She's currently working as a sustainable food system resource specialist through Tuskegee's Carver Integrative Sustainability Center. She works in food justice and community sustainability efforts. She studied policy advocacy for strengthening grassroots efforts from a state level, also at international levels. Her leadership focuses on educating underserved populations on self-sufficiency and healthy lifestyles, while also encouraging the larger community to pursue a sustainable local economy. So we'll be hearing from her, and followed by Miko Tyler, who provides the foundation around the 1994 land grant tribal colleges. And he is a Musqueam, Shawnee, and Asiko, and he recently became the Dean of Academic Affairs at the College of Muskogee Nation. Along with his duties at the university, he serves as a CMN Cultural Community Garden Committee and as the project director for 2 NIFA grants. He enjoys teaching and learning about his tribal heritage, especially about corn. He has a BS in business administration from Haskell Indian Nations University and a JD from the University of Kansas School of Law. That's an amazing combination there. And then finally, we'll also hear from Alex Raceless. I'm sorry. I am being tongue-tied a bit today. I apologize. Been talking all day. He is with a Hispanic Serving Agricultural College University, and he's going to provide a foundation and background from that perspective. He is an associate professor with a joint appointment in the Department of Biology and the School of Earth, Environmental, and Marine Science at the University of Texas, Reno, Grand Valley. He leads the Agroecology and Resilience Food Systems program, focused on participatory research and education in restoration agriculture, agroecology, and natural resources conservation and management. He directs the Subtropical Soil Health Demonstration Conservation Innovation Trials, and that is a federal funded project regarding ecological, socioeconomic, and agroeconomic implications of cover crops and reducing tillage in South Texas. He is also co-director of the UTRGV Center for Sustainable Agriculture and Rural Advancement, which focuses on capacity building for local students, university and college partners, and farms and producers through technical assistance, access to learning opportunities, and genuine community engagement. So as you can tell, there's a lot we're going to hear from our panelists. We encourage you throughout their talks to put your questions in the question and answers, and we'll be curating those along the way. I'd like to turn the conversation over to Dr. Lindsay Lunsford.
Thank you so much, Renee. And thank you for that warm introduction, and thank you for setting up the stage. Like Renee said, I'm here to talk to you about the impact of 1890 institutions and a little bit about the history of 1890 institutions and how Renee was referencing to kind of get us out of the deficit model in thinking about 1890 institutions specifically and the way that they relate. And then also the way that white supremacy through policy and structures has been enacted and has played out for over a century, nearing a century and a half. So a lot of the things that I'll speak to you about today will come directly from a text. I'm a bit of a book nerd, so I actually have the book with me, and I will send it out in a recommendation list, but I recommend anyone that would like to take a deeper dive and to really understand the way that land grant agriculture has been denied to African-American communities within our nation for, like I said, over a century, nearing a century and a half. Please check out this text. It's actually called Disparity, and it's written by Rupert Grant Seals, and it's an analysis of the historical, political, and funding factors at the state level affecting Black academic agriculture. So as you can see on the screen before you, this is a map of the U.S. land grant institutions. If you can look a little bit closer. So when you see the red ones, the red circle on the map are the 1862 institutions, which some people refer to as PWI, or predominantly white institutions. And then you'll see the star next to the 1890 institutions, which are the HBCUs, or historically Black colleges and universities. And then there's also a blue square that will show you where the tribal colleges are within our nation, and those are referred to commonly as 1994. So the colleges are referred to by years a lot. So you'll hear 1890, 1862, 1994, and these are referring to the actual years that the legislature went through to enact these institutions. So if we take ourselves back to 1862, the driving force and how they're called land grants, right? So where did we get this land? So this was taken, indigenous native lands that were taken and seized from native communities, and the point for the government was to figure out what to do with this land. And so you have the invention of these land grant agriculture schools, where this taken land is granted to these states to establish these schools. And the purpose, because at this time, college wasn't a widespread system as it is today, for these institutions weren't created. College was more for a wealthy elite. You had your Harvards and things like that. And so this was bringing college to the everyman, and education was the driving force was to improve agriculture in the United States. So we were becoming a nation, we were developing, and we had to feed ourselves. And so that's where we got with the 1862 institutions. Representative Justin Morrill of Vermont introduced the bill to establish these agricultural schools on grants of federal land. Now, each state received 30,000 acres of federal land, right? Federal in quotes, because we know this, we sort of know, well, we should know how we got that land, or land scrip, which were certificates of entitlement. Now, the sale and use of this land was used to support at least one college for teaching ag and mechanical arts in the state. But this legislature prohibited the actual use of constructing or maintaining buildings at that time. So that would have to be updated later. But at this time, you see, this is for predominantly white institutions. So at this time, and it's really important that we understand why land grants are important, not just because we work in them, but because land grants are important because land grant agriculture is an economic tool. It's a tool for economic development. It's how we built communities and how we built large facets of our society today. And so it's important to understand that that was denied to, at this point, African Americans, Native and Hispanic people. So moving into that, we see 1862, what do we do about African-American people? What do we do about them? So we have, coming into the next slide, 1890. So the provisions were that you couldn't, the states that chose to exclude, to not have Black and white people go to school together, were states predominantly in the South, and this created 16. So we get to 1890, where the legislation is passed in what is called the Second Morrill Act. It's still Senator Morrill, so the second Representative Morrill. So in the Second Morrill Act, that's what establishes the HBCUs. resources were supposed to be equitably divided. However, there was no appropriations for funding for these institutions, the 1890 institutions, and it would not be for over 130 years. They wouldn't get those appropriations until the 70s, although the presidents of these institutions fought for this since the beginning. And I apologize, it established 19 institutions, mostly, not all, but mostly in the southeast of the US. And we saw that in the previous slide. And now there were subsequent acts. So this is what got us the institutions, right? But what about research and what about extension? So as you see moving forward, research came about. We had two important acts. We have the Hatch Act of 1887, and then we have the Evans-Allen Act of 1977. These helped to establish the agricultural experiment stations, and it provided appropriations to start to conduct research at these stations. However, only 1862s were eligible for these funds until 1977. So over 100 years, African Americans were excluded were excluded from these funds. And it's immeasurable to count up the impact of what that had for them to develop and to even still be able to do the work that they were able to do under these constraints. And then Evans-Allen did not include eligibility when they were enacted for 1994 institutions, but it was the Evans-Allen Act of 1977, which gave 1890 institutions access to agricultural research. And we'll move into one important thing that I want to talk about before we end, just so that you get the highest level points of this, is that you might wonder, like, well, was it about race? Is that why we have predominantly white schools and predominantly Black schools? Like, what is the difference here? And it's very important to understand the climate and the mindset. So in the Hope Smith of the Smith-Lever Act in 1914 to establish extension said, and this was in a congressional debate, he said, "I will tell the senator frankly what we will do. We will put into our white agricultural college. We will not appropriate $1 in Georgia to undertake to do extension work from the Negro agricultural agricultural mechanical school. It would be a waste of money." So, and that's the representative, that's the Senator Hoke Smith of Georgia. That's what he said when he debated this bill. So it's not like it was like an accident or there was no culpability in excluding not only these people, but these communities and these subsequent generations from access to this capital and to access to build themselves and build resources. It was intentional and it was race-based. And as you can imagine, some of the racial attitudes towards African Americans in 1914. So again, I encourage anyone looking to get further information to definitely pick up this book and to understand two really important points. One, our nation's, and I'm reading a direct quote, "Our nation's most potent and successful device for dealing with the problem of agriculture and rural development is the land grant movement, and it was virtually denied to African Americans." Second, is that the Black Land Grant College, or 1890s HBCUs, have been stifled at the state level for nearly 100, and at this time it was 130 years, but this book came out in the late 90s. So we're looking at nearly 150 years where these schools do not still receive their, to this day, many of these schools do not receive their federally mandated state one-to-one matching. So I'm going to end here, but just encourage anyone that is interested to just understand that the depth of this disparity is long-standing, and at this point it's generational and it's definitely institutional. And so I would like to end there and pass it over to Miko Tyner to get into more about the disparity with 1994 colleges. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Greet everybody with a good spiritual greeting. Gomagadi in my Muskogee language. I'm Muskogee Creek, Shawnee, and Seneca. So earlier, Lindsay addressed the land where it came from the Native Americans. Specifically, 245 tribes were affected in the land taking or the land grant universities taking land. Over 10 million acres of land was granted, and 52 universities benefited in that. There were 160 violence-backed treaties and land seizures that The tribes negotiated with the federal government, but the federal government did not honor. From the first treaty that the United States established with the Delaware tribe, they did not honor those treaties. And then there's about 79,000 parcels of land distributed. And in today's dollars, an endowment of $495 million was raised from those land scripts, from the land takings, from the map there. And this is all from the High Country News, from the land grab universities. If you have not read this article, I urge you to go out there and read it to learn more about the land grant system and where all the land went, where the money came from, and where what tribe was affected in your area. Next slide, please. And so on the 1994s, the federal government finally established tribal college, recognized tribal colleges. Earlier on in the federal system, they began doing Indian education in the 1860s and as assimilation. The school that I went to for undergrad, Haskell Indian Nation University, was set up as a training institute for our Indian children. And so they were taking our Indian children from the reservation, taking them out of that food system, and teaching them this alternative food system. And so over time, as the federal government changed their policy towards Indian education, the tribes started their own education system. And the first one was Navajo Community College. They established their tribal college on the reservation there in 1968. They were the first tribal college. Later on in 1973, as more tribes began establishing their tribal colleges, AHEC was created, the American Indian Higher Education Consortium. And it started out with 6 institutions, but it has grown now to 36. In 2004, my college, the College of Muskogee Nation, was established in Okmulgee, Oklahoma. We were partnered with the OSU system, and it was a building process. And in 2014, after we gained a candidacy status with the Higher Learning Commission, we were granted a land grant status. In 2005, Falcon, the first American land grant consortium, was established for the tribal colleges. Next slide, please. And so in 1994, the federal government finally recognized the tribal colleges as land grant institutions, which is ironic. This is where all the land came from. And so in 1994, we were finally recognized. And in that initial bill, it was Equity and Land Grant Status Act. And at that time, there were 29 TCUs. And the federal government established a $4.5 million endowment between those 29 institutions, which is kind of roughly $150,000 per institution. And then in 1998, we were included in that update of ag research, extension, and education reform. And so we were able to apply for agricultural funding we had a partner with the 1862 or 1890 institution. Most of the tribal colleges don't have an extension per se. And so as of 2019, there are 29 tribal colleges and universities designated as land grant. I think one of the things that as a tribal college that I have noticed is that I'm from Oklahoma, and we have 3 of the land grant institutions. We have the 1862, the 1890, and now the 1994. I think the 1994s kind of get as a native people, we're marginalized, and so we're kind of left out of the loop. I mean, this coming 2022, a lot of the tribal colleges can now apply for FERTIP extension grants, whereas it was only for the 1862s and the 1890s. And so now we're seeing the TCUs being included in the discussion for extension. And after that, I'll turn it over to Alex. So thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mako. Yeah, well, I'm very pleased to be here. I am at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, which is the southmost college in the continental U.S. We are at the very tip of South Texas, right along the U.S.-Mexico border. And I was invited to present a little bit today about this designation for Hispanic Serving Ag Colleges and Universities. And I am not surprised that not too many people know what it means to be a Hispanic Serving Ag College and University. You're probably all more familiar with what it means to be a Hispanic Serving Institution. That is a federal designation that requires that 25% of the students or more are Hispanic. I'd like to just step back a little bit and give you a context of that designation and in particular, because unlike tribal colleges and HBCUs, this was a designation that is based almost entirely on demography and not necessarily on being having a legacy of serving these populations. The term Hispanic Serving Institution became an official designation formalized in 1992 when Congress reauthorized the 1965 Higher Education Act under Title III, and again in 1998 under Title V, where they defined a HSI as an accredited and degree granting public institution of higher education with 25% or more total undergraduate Hispanic full-time student enrollment. And this was a culmination of the Hispanic caucus and several universities, mostly out of New Mexico and Texas, who really pushed their representatives to fight for this designation. They were inspired by the progress being made and opportunities gained by HBCUs and tribal colleges around that time. And so this idea of a Hispanic institution started gaining traction about a dozen years before its official designation. So like in '86, for example, leaders from New Mexico and Texas created what is known as HACU, which is the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities. And it was really with HACU that they were able to define this designation of a university or college with a student population of 25% or more. And so the truth is that most Hispanic serving institutions are actually predominantly white institutions that experience a demographic shift. And that is true for the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley and our predecessor universities, which are University of Texas Pan American and University of Texas Brownsville, that were largely white in terms of their student enrollment. But because of the rapid increase in Hispanic populations, and in particular with Mexican populations in their schools, they actually became a institution of high enrollment for Hispanic students. Currently, UTRGV actually has about 91% student population that identify as Hispanic, most of who are Mexican. So we actually have the highest concentration of Hispanic students in the U.S. outside of Puerto Rico. And so it's quite different because, you know, HSIs as a designation is relatively recent. And of course, like the journeys of HBCUs and TCUs, there weren't very many funds appropriated for these schools. And it wasn't until, you know, half a dozen a year later that former Congressman Ruben Hinojosa, who was from my district in Texas, really pushed to create Title V funding for HSIs that are different from HBCUs and tribal colleges, and to actually designate specific HSI funding. And so there is actually funding available for HSIs. A lot of it came from Title V and some of it from Title III. Most of it is available for capacity building, but having a designation as an HSI also allows you to qualify for federal funding and also compete for federal funding. And so you actually are seeing institutions across the United States that actually are trying intentionally to increase their Hispanic student population so they can get over that threshold of 25%. And then, in doing so, they can be, you know, competitive for these awards that are designated for HSIs, for capacity building, for expansion of education programs, and for other funding that that they can compete, that they now can compete for. So, since 1995, when kind of the designation really came up, we've seen the number of HSIs grow from 189 to about 435 is the last count I saw, probably in 2018. And more colleges and universities are qualifying as an HSI each year. The funding from 1995 to 2014 went from 12 million to almost 100 million, which is really enabling HSIs to increase access for higher education for the students that they serve. HSIs account for about 60% of all Latino students in the United States, and they actually are the ones who are helping Latino students, Hispanic students, actually earn degrees, associates or bachelor's degrees, and actually helping enable a diversified set of graduates because they themselves are the ones producing those students. And so this title of Hispanic Serving Ag College actually came after the 2008 Farm Bill, where they wanted to set aside a specific set of funding for Hispanic serving institutions that served, that awarded degrees in agriculture to Hispanic students. So some of the qualifications are that you actually have to be a Hispanic serving institution, which means that you have to have 25 of your students and your full-time students enrolled that identify as Hispanic, that you have to offer ag-related programs, and that Hispanic students receive at least 15% of the degrees awarded in these ag-related programs over a course of 2 years. You can't be a 1862 land-grant institution. So, some schools that qualify as HSIs that are land-grant institutions may not qualify as a Hispanic Serving Ag College and University. The intention is so that you can allow some universities to qualify for a set of funding that maybe, that would be available to those universities and not to other universities like 1862s. The truth is that as far as I know, no funding has been appropriated since 2008 for Hispanic serving agricultural colleges and universities. There's really no specific advantage to having that designation in terms of having access to funding. One of the things that I'd like to mention is that, some of the funding that is available for Hispanic serving institutions like UTRGV are what they call capacity grants. You've recently seen, and the National Science Foundation has a set of funding thanks to the work of the Hispanic Caucus in Congress. They have just recently set aside funding for Hispanic serving institutions, of which most of it is capacity building. And it's an interesting set of funds because it allows, the development of programs. It allows the development of new equipment, for example, for a lot of these institutions. One of the things that I'd like to mention is that there are what Renee mentioned at the beginning of this call, this idea of a deficit model, right? I mean, and we approach this a lot in the way we write grants, and we talk about Hispanic serving institutions as institutions that serve students who are historically underserved, who are associated with low graduation rates and low retention rates. And it's like, like African Americans in the Deep South and elsewhere, and like students who attend tribal colleges, Hispanic American students also experienced a lot of these disenfranchisements that you would see documented throughout the 19th and 20th century, like with segregation in schools, segregation, social segregation, labor segmentation, and UTRGV, of course, has a history of that as well, as a predominantly white institution that became a Hispanic serving institution. I mean, there are like a complex web of historical circumstances that caused Hispanic Americans, and in particular ethnic Americans in South Texas, where I work, to rank among the poorest, the least educated, and the unhealthiest demographic in the country. This is well documented. Tim Bowman wrote a book called Blood Oranges. It's a fantastic read. You can understand a little bit more about that historical context. And often we write about that in grants, and we write about that, we read about that in requests for applications, where these institutions, because they are underserved and they are historically underserved or under-resourced, then we maybe offer them a little bit of extra funding. Okay, and I think this is where some of these designations arise, when we start to realize that, hey, look, maybe we should set aside some funding, or at least have a special designation for colleges and universities that actually reach and target Hispanic students. There's a business element there, where we are trying to perpetuate a system that focuses on skill development in preparation for workforce. You read a lot about this. Oh, we need more diversified workforce. We need to satisfy the need of labor markets, and we need to produce citizen workers who can actually fill that need. And so a lot of the funding available to us is that type of funding. And it kind of counters educational wisdom of providing students, and in particular minority students, with an equitable education that fosters intellectual growth and development, that develops human capital, that captures local knowledge, that focuses on cultural wealth, that dismantles deficit thinking, and really tries to promote critical consciousness in our students. Who they are, where they're from, actually has a lot to do with where we would like them to go, right? I mean, one of my colleagues calls for a serious investment in institutions like ours that are trying to build capacity in researchers, in teachers, and in students of color, who are more likely to work with farmers of color, or more likely to work with industry partners that are part of that equation of a diverse workforce, that are part of the equation of increased equity in our country. And so, so I think that part of the invitation of me being here is to really try to explore how we can advocate for a genuine investment in these types of institutions that does this type of meaningful work, and not necessarily like investment that just kind of perpetuates the business model of higher education, but really kind of builds a new model of types of minority serving institutions. So this journey that I've explained to you about how UTRGV is at the cusp of really trying to be a Hispanic serving institution, not just designated as one federally, but really being a Hispanic serving institution. We are actually trying to explore that. We work with students who live in a region that has the highest concentration of Hispanic farmers in the entire country, and they have the skills to work with farmers in our area, work with business folks in our areas, if we have the ability to help train them to do so, and to do so meaningfully. I would like to give a lot of this credit to some of my colleagues who wrote a very interesting narrative and a paper about this that any of you guys could read. It's published in the Association of Mexican American Educators. My colleagues Maritza de la Trinidad and Francisco Guajardo are co-authors on a paper that documents almost everything that I've mentioned today. If you really want to deep dive into the evolution of a Hispanic serving institution and where Hispanic ag colleges and universities fit into that, I would suggest you read that paper, because as I mentioned, a lot of the information I presented today is in that paper. And I'll stop there.
Right. Well, thank you very much to all of our panelists and really inviting us deeply into this conversation. So at this point, we're going to actually welcome Rich Pirog into the discussion, and we're going to have some conversation here amongst our panelists. And I just kind of want to kick that off with a first question to you. What can be done? So we're having a webinar talking about working across organizations. What can be done to help build pluralistic relationships across the land grants and across the Hispanic serving agricultural colleges, universities? So when we talk about pluralistic, we're talking about looking at the relationships of equity in power, equitable power, and also in resource sharing. So I invite you to just talk a little bit about what does that look like, and how do we do that in a way that addresses white supremacy and racism and the impact of that on our food system. Who'd like to start with that?
I'll go ahead and start, Renee. I think
Okay.
one of the things is to include the 1994s in the discussions. It seems like in my home state, we're kind of, as I mentioned earlier, we're marginalized. So, I mean, a lot of people don't know that we exist. I mean, we're a small institution, but there are 36 others tribal colleges out there. And just recently, we became involved with Coming Together for Racial Understanding in 2019. It's been an effort that began early on in, I think, 2016. And so I think we were included right at the last minute. I think OSU included us in on those conversations. And so we got involved. I think in other states, I don't think that maybe those 1862 land grants include the 1994s. I think there's a lot of, maybe there might be some distrust too from the TCUs in dealing with those state colleges. I mean, there's a lot of, I think competitions or just a lot of not reaching across the aisle or reaching across the state to those tribal colleges. I think there's some distrust, and there's just maybe we don't want to work with them for some reason. But I think if the tribal colleges are included, I think they're going to be more willing to reach out and partner with them. I think a lot of the grants, that you have to collaborate either with an 1862 or 1890, and a lot of times in my dealings, a lot of times it's just kind of maybe the week before our grants are due, somebody contacts me for a letter of support or something, and but there's really no meaningful dialogue, to write a grant that's going to have impact at the 1890 or the 1862 and the 1994. I think it's going to take to build upon that relationship, to have a meaningful relationship, to really be sincere and get to know one another pretty much.
Right. Yeah. And thank you for that. I know when we were preparing, you talked a bit about the fact that some things historically have led to that distrust or reluctancy to actually engage, into, those types of relationships.
Yeah, I think that just that mechanism of sovereignty, our tribes are sovereign nations. And I think this past summer, the McGirt decision here in Oklahoma, it kind of affirmed our tribal sovereignty within our reservation system here in the state of Oklahoma, but there's still a conflict with the state and the tribes. And so it's kind of furlonged that process from the removal to today.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Lindsay, would you share a little bit on your perspective as we talk about building pluralistic relationships and how you've been able to do some of that work, in what you've been doing in Tuskegee?
Yes, thank you, Renee. One of my favorite quotes by strategist Ella Baker is, "If you shine light, people will find the way." And so I think a lot of it is, and like Rich said earlier, we can only build our relationships at the speed of trust. And I think with trust, you need accountability. And with accountability, you need accuracy in telling what happened. So telling this history, telling these stories, and then acknowledging that this disparity still occurs. So it's hard to go out and build new relationships when people are still not being paid equitably, when resources are still not being shared. So it's hard to have, and it can seem disingenuous. It's nice to come and gather around a meal, but if at the end of the day, I have to clean up and I had to cook it, and I have to like sit in the corner. It's not the best meal for me. Like, I'm going to show up and smile because that's the type of person that I am, but that's extractive and it's a disservice to myself. So I think we have to be a lot more honest and engaging, and then also understand the regionality. It's hard for some schools maybe up north that don't have an HBC, that don't have a 1994, don't have an 1890 in their state. So it's like, well, how are you going to tell a state in the South that does have another school what to do and how to share their money and how to share their funds when you're not necessarily dealing with the same constraints? And these are relationships. So these are people that have been knowing and working with each other for, decades. And this is a system. And this is like, and it's also important to understand that they didn't just start getting funding in 1977 because we've reached this like point of like racial awakening and like reckoning. It's like, no, like these presidents and these directors of these institutions at these 1890s. And I call that out because they were the ones for the longest they're fighting so that you could have a 1994, so you could have Hasecos. And so they fought and it took them a century plus to get the funding. And even then it was not matched equitably. And someone asked in the chat box, what happens if a state doesn't match? What's the consequence? Well, the consequence is they can get a waiver, and almost no state has ever been denied a waiver. And if a state is just like, well, we can only match, 50%. Well, the federal government can turn around and say, well, since your state won't give you 100, they only want to give you 50. I've chosen to now give you 50 as well. And so if you look at the history of some of these HBCUs that have nearly almost had to shut their doors because federal funding is so much an important part of their makeup compared to large schools that have a football team or have athletics programs that can supplement them. These federal dollars are pivotal to these institutions. So I think telling the truth and telling it often, and then also giving us credit to all of our lineage. I know MSU, I helped to inform an article they put out about the first extension agent, who's actually an African-American man that came from a Black college, which is Thomas Monroe Campbell. People don't realize that, this idea of extension wasn't just something that spontaneously came about and was able to reach the nation. It was taken and modeled after people that were having to do it to sustain their communities in the wake of actual antebellum slavery. Like, we're actually coming out of Reconstruction. Like, that's why, and so that's our root and that's our history. So not to be long-winded, I would just say, in order to really build relationships, we have to build trust. In order to build trust, we have to tell the whole story and not just like, well, we've reached a point, like from here on, let's make better choices. It's like, let's look back and let's kind of tally up. What would it have looked like had these schools existed? Had they not been stifled for nearly 130 years? What would these communities look like that they're serving? How much different would they be? So I think those are some of the questions that we have to ask ourselves.
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to invite all of you to kind of jump in and share a bit, because when we were preparing, for this conversation today, just this whole asset-based approach and the fact that these institutions that you represent are rich and are doing amazing works and are developing partnerships and, leveraging resources and things to get things done and producing amazing results in the process in spite of, right? And I think it's important that we've heard the disparities, and people are grounded now in that understanding. I would invite you to share a little bit, and we're going to bridge this into the conversation to bring our participants, our audience into this. But I really would like to hear, each of you just take a minute or two and just kick this conversation into gear from that perspective, from being rich communities, using the assets that you have to produce the results you want through your institutions. Please, if I could just, I'll just do a quick roll call, and then we're going to flip it out and invite our participants to really join in and by taking some of their questions. But if I could ask each of you to say a little bit around that. And Rich, we haven't heard your voice yet. So if you could speak to that from the perspective of 1862s and the kinds of things that you've been involved in and seen to help bridge the partnerships that are producing more of this asset-based approach.
I'll just speak briefly, Renee, and just say, just recognizing and having conversations. When we started having conversations with Alex over the last 2 years, as Lindsay and Miko and others on the Racial Equity Food System Work Group have had conversations. There's so much that we have to learn in our 1862 institutions. We don't even think about these other institutions, sadly, in any context. As Miko said, we think of them as, unfortunately, as a partner that we can have access to other sources of funds for. And that whole idea has to be reimagined and rethought from a more of a moralistic and values perspective to get things started. There was at least 1 or 2 comments in the Q&A box from some colleagues I know saying, "Hey, I didn't even realize about half of the stuff that's being discussed here." It's not even, we don't even, we get training and development, but we don't even learn the context of how we got to this place. And we can't solve issues unless we understand how they were created and how they occurred over not just 100 years, but longer than that. So to me, that's a starting point from an 1862 perspective. I know a lot of the people, just looking at the registrations, came from 1862s that are on this webinar, and I really challenge you all to really listen deeply and not be the first ones to speak. Really listen for understanding so that you can ask better questions.
Okay.
I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks, Rich. Alex, would you mind jumping in? Because I know, again, as we prepared, you shared some amazing examples from work that you've done.
Yeah, it's interesting. In 1987, there was a philosopher from South Texas. Her name is Gloria Ansaldúa. She wrote a book called La Frontera, or the Borderlands in English. And Gloria Ansaldúa, she was just recognized as one of the most influential scholars of the 20th century. She actually documents in that book of how she first came to the University of Texas Pan American at the time, which was, and she was given, this is in chapter 4, I believe, of her book. It's called How to Tame a Wild Tongue. And she was given an accent test in order to get into college. Now, this is not too long ago, 80s, 70s, right? And if you had a really strong accent, you would be put in remedial English and, be a remedial student. Now, this is an example, right? At the moment, University of Texas Rio Grande Valley is trying to become one of the first bilingual universities in the country because of our demography. You begin to recognize the difference between the 1960s and 70s into where we are now, where all of a sudden bilingualism, or the ability to read and speak and write and communicate in 2 languages, is actually an asset and not a deficit. Now, that came with, of course, that big demographic change that I told that happened in the region, where all of a sudden you started to see more and more Hispanic folks and more people in power that can that understand and value the culture, the language, and the history of the region, right? And this has to do with faculty too, right? I mean, how will you will be so surprised, Renee, how many faculty we have at our university or at HSIs or Hisakus all over the country who don't even know what that means, who don't even understand how, like as Lindsay mentioned, how hard people worked to get this designation. And still today, we're fighting for appropriations for that designation, and then of course, what it means to actually become a Hispanic serving institution, because the federal designation means really nothing because there isn't much funding tied to it. And there isn't much, there hasn't been much investment in it, right? Now, I'm not going to discount like the importance of being recognized as a Hispanic serving institution, because those institutions do have a role. They do have at least a quarter of their students who identify Hispanic. But in part, I mean, you see the big disparities. There was a recent, study done. I can't remember who did it, where they found that the average student at a Hispanic Serving Institution has $90 invested per student, whereas an average student at HBCU has more than $1,500 per student invested. And in part, it's because of the way funding is designated to Hispanic Serving Institutions, where there is no real formula funding. It's just through competitions. We just have an advantage through competitions, and how some agencies set aside money for HSIs through competition. Now, what's happening now is a lot of the big institutions, including 1862, are now being recognized as a Hispanic serving college or university. And of course, when they can compete for the same funds that we can compete for, we are often outcompeted. Now, I recently got a grant from NIFA where they celebrated the fact that I was one of the only 2 non-land grant institutions to ever receive this award in its 25-year history, right? And it's about capacity, right? We may never have the capacity to compete for or against these larger colleges where there's a tremendous amount of federal investment, and of course, with the histories that they have, right? We may never be able to compete for them. And so there's a question about, capacity building that I think is important at these minority serving institutions. How do we build the capacity within our own institutions? So this is where we need an assets-based framework, because you have to say, okay, what do we have to work with? Okay, we have to work with students who are bilingual. We have to work with students who are family-centered and who understand kind of the situations that other family-centered farmers deal with. I'll tell you, like, there's an example, in the Justin Morrill, when he wrote the Morrill Act of 1862, he writes in there that the opportunities afforded by 1862 colleges are for the sons of toil, basically for the sons of farmers. And it worked really well because those sons of farmers actually had the life experience to be able to commiserate, understand, relate to farmers. And so when they got to farms, they were, after they went to college, they would learn about these things and they would give advice, but with the farmer in mind, right? Understanding the farmer, understanding who they are, where they're from, understanding some of the realities that they have. Now, over the years, students who go to land-grant institutions are not necessarily the sons of toil anymore. They are folks who maybe never even stepped in the field. I have a colleague who's a soil scientist who told me that she'd never been on a farm before. And so these farmers, these scientists aren't necessarily, those who can understand, who can commiserate, who can work with, who can work with farmers of color, because they may not understand that either. And so I think we have tremendous assets to work with. Now, is that enough? Probably not, but it's a start, right? It's a start to say, okay, what can we do well? And, I know that the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley can train Hispanic students well. And, we're starting to see this now where predominantly white institutions are telling us, you know what, send us your students. We will train them. And then, of course, we lose that capacity and we lose the intellectual capital of those students and the social capital of those students. And so we perpetually are in the situation we're in. So that's my just kind of 2 cents.
Okay. Thank you for that, Alex. We're going to take some of the questions that we've gotten from our participants. We've got over 200 folks hanging out with us today. And I'm going to group some of the questions together. One that I'm seeing here asked, there's several questions that are based in this thought, is how do you engage? What kind of approaches can you take that help build trust and relationships, across institutions, across 1862s, 1890s, 94s, Hispanic serving at colleges, universities, and people want to know things like, how do you do that in a way that is that builds trust, that is done in a manner that's respectful, And at what levels do you start? Do you start with the administrators, the faculty? How can students even help pave this way? And how do things like leadership accountability weigh in, on that? So there were several questions about approach to relationship, pretty much anchored in trust, relationship building, and accountability. And where do you start? What are some success stories that you can share, or some ideas about that? Anyone can jump in. Okay, there you are, Miko.
All right. Well, Renee, I think initially it starts from the top, but eventually it's the middleman going out there making those relationships. But it starts at the top with the key players that say, this is the initiative that we want. This is the approach. We want to have this relationship with y'all, not just to not for our success, but for the success of the student. Because eventually, maybe a student at CMN may go up to OSU Stillwater or Langston, and so they're gonna be gaining something while working with the institution. Mm-hmm. But it starts at top, and then from there, like when we got involved with the coming together for racial understanding, I think it was OSU that told my president about it, and it was just like it was coming in a couple of weeks, and somehow we got everything to there, and that we're able to participate, as a TCU. And so it took the top people to want this initiative. And then now we've been meeting for the past year virtually, and each institution's been sending some of their extension workers to the trainings. And I think we've had 14 participate. And so it's been a good working relationship, because we probably would never have come together. They're from all over the state of Oklahoma. And so this virtual has connected us. And so I think that was a starting point for us to really to sit down and talk to one another and see each other and just learn about each other.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Other thoughts in terms of how to approach this engagement, and how do you activate faculty? How do you activate students in this process? Engage them, as well as your top leaders. So that was definitely a place. If you don't have the top going, sometimes it takes a while to do bottom up, right?
Yeah. You know what, Renee? Someone once told me sometimes you just got to wait for somebody to retire or die. And so, and I'm not saying that's what we're going to wait for, but I'm saying that sometimes it's easier to work in your closest circle of influence, right? I mean, that is straight out of what's the guy who wrote 7 Habits of Effective?
Yeah.
That guy, Steve something.
Yeah.
And so, one of the things that we're doing at the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley is we're inviting faculty to understand what it means to be at a Hispanic Serving Institution. So I actually direct a program where we bring in faculty and we introduce them to through a series of, it's a year-long workshop. And before COVID, we would start with a 3-day tour of our region. They and their families could hop on a bus, and we would take them around, and we would explain them the history, the culture, and the language of the region, and all the assets that the region has to offer, in which to train our students. Ultimately, the people and the communities of where we live have the same goal as we do, which is to train our students to help improve the well-being of the region. Okay. So, some of it is to just get those faculty, because faculty are really important and very influential, is to get them to understand where they are. And sometimes it starts with that self-reflection. Well, who are you? And where did you come from? In historically Black colleges, I understand that they hire a lot of faculty who are also Black. And at HSIs, that's not the case. You can actually see the lag of the demographic shift, because, in most of our institutions across the country, we are still very much predominantly white faculty. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that they cannot understand and grasp their students, their history, the students, the assets, the families, and bring that into the classroom. And so that's how we start. We start those faculty. We start with the faculty, because then they can take that. And so in part of our training, we actually get them to reinvent their teaching philosophy and to understand the privilege and the responsibility they have as a faculty at a Hispanic Serving Institution. Then we also give them different pedagogical frameworks that include cultural relevant pedagogy, that include community engagement, so that they can then affect their students in that way. So we actually have a bunch of examples. If anybody's interested, I can type my website in the chat, our program's website in the chat, and you can download actual curriculum taught at UTRGV that helps serve our students in particular. And then also you can download the topics and the themes, all the agendas of the faculty development workshops that we offer. It's all online.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, so one of the other questions that was asked is, how do we get others to advocate on behalf of the need to fill this resource gap for funding and for other types of resources that really enable you to move forward in developing, programs and delivering, services in the communities that you're in and that you're representing. So what are your thoughts around other ways that people can help advocate to close the resource gap?
Thanks for that question, Renee. I think that's a great question, because when I look at the questions in the chat box, and even like with Alex saying, so HBCUs do hire a number of African Americans, but they also hire a large number of non-African American, non-Black specifically, and like people from all over the world, right? And so these aren't just all Black spaces. These are spaces that are not only serving Black communities, but especially like in our rural area, they're serving poor white rural farmers. They're serving everyone that they have in their service area. So to realize that they're a benefit not just to Black people or Black things, but to the nation and to some of the people that have the furthest down when it comes to conditions and who they work with, compared to some of your larger farmers. When you look at who's actually working with the small minority farmers, it's a lot of your HBCUs. And so one of the things that I wanted to also point, and also they're working with Hispanic farmers and Indigenous farmers and people. So it's not like just this school works with just this clientele. HBCUs work, we at Tuskegee specifically, we work with tribal nations, we work with Hispanic communities, and we work with Black and white communities. We work with everyone. But what I would think about when people talk about students having a role, faculty having a role, everyone having a role, I want us to knock it to rose-colored glasses and understanding that these are deeply ingrained systemic issues at the policy level. So when we wanted to make it illegal to drive your car without a seatbelt, when we wanted to change the laws around marijuana, when we wanted to change the laws around guns, we didn't just say should we do a bake sale? Should we talk about it? Should we have a party? No, we put into serious lobbying and action. People's careers were all day making sure that cigarettes had a label on the side. When we want to change things from a political standpoint in this country, we don't have a bake sale. Maybe some folks do. That could be a part of it. But we have serious political strategy and action. So I don't want people to think we're dealing with something lighter than we are. This is a serious prognosis. If you were told you had a serious disease in your body, you might want to just do something holistic, or not saying holistic, but you might want to just, ignore it till it goes away or ask a friend. But if you had something serious, you want to go to a specialist. You want to go to someone who can fix you, who can prepare you, who can make you healthy again. So we have to stop pretending that we don't have what we have, which is systematic racism and white supremacy and our land grant agriculture system. So that's going to take advocacy on all levels. It's not the students. Their students are there to get an education. It's not their burden to educate you and to also educate the political factors. So we do need students there, but they have a role in advocacy, maybe, and engagement, but it's not their role to carry this mantle for us. nor is it faculty, and maybe even administrations at their schools. Like, this is a large issue that is social and cultural and political. And so when you want to change society, culture, and policy, you have to start telling different stories. We need to start talking about this. Actually go get Rupert Seal's books, read those articles that were posted, educate yourself so you understand within the depths of you why this is a problem and what you can do in your arena to educate it. To become more educated so you can understand to help other people. So for one, if you want to help or find help, first, start with your own education. Be aware of this so that you can start being aware when you see it in your offices. Because just to say like, well, how can I want to do a project, I want to bring this school in and bring this school in and put a slash as it at 1890 is not the same as in 1994, nor is the culture or tradition of these people. So it's not like, how do I get them and we come together? No, like we got to get into the basis and the root. And it's more than just having a program and us working together. And when people say there's not a history of us working together, that means there is a long-standing history of us not working together. And so that needs to be investigated. To just say, oh, we haven't worked together means we haven't worked together. And there are specific reasons why. And those should be investigated before starting. So it's not to be fatalistic. And it's just to be, you know, like if you have a doctor telling you have an illness, like you don't want him to be like, hey, you may or may not be okay in a year. I don't know, you know, you want directness, you want honesty and what you're truly facing so you can understand the gravity of it, so you can then change your actions to have a better life outcome. So that's what I would present. Oh, and last thing, reparations. And I don't just mean reparations as in for African-American descendants of slavery. I mean reparations within the land grant system. 130 years, these schools were denied funding solely because they were Black. Like that is, we have quotes in record, them saying, no, Black schools, no money. So what about that? Like what's the restitution look like for that? So these are conversations we need to start having amongst ourselves, within ourselves, and those within our networks.
Thank you for that. And I'm seeing all these connections. I hope others are hearing them, that the change has to happen at all different levels. So you talk about the policy level. Alex talked about people getting out into the area right near where they live, where they work, where they're serving, and understanding the cultural context. Miko talked a little bit about the fact that there's things that have lended distrust along the way in relationships, and we have to deal with those elements as well. I'd like to pose a final question and have each of our panelists weigh in on this, because we've talked about, and I appreciate Lindsay talking about, not necessarily having rose-colored glasses. The question the panelists had for our audience was just, what do we do next? And would like to have each of you just to share, if you had the wand, if you had the wish, what would you say to everyone listening here today? The one thing that you would advocate for, that you would invite, people to consider doing. We've heard about education. Is there one last thing that you would each add to say that from your successful experiences in working across relationships and explicitly going, overcoming the barriers that racism and white supremacy form? What is the one parting thing that you would say to each person? And I'd like to begin that with Miko, if you wouldn't mind going first.
Okay, thanks, Renee. I think first and foremost, I think we just have to acknowledge that there is a problem there, and then be having that open mind, open heart to really do something about it. I think you just look at the years of the land grants when they were granted. There's years of disparity there, and so I think we have to be open. We have to want. I think when we say TCUs or tribal colleges, yes, the mission is for the tribal students, but I mean we're an open enrollment institution, so anybody can come to the College of Muskogee Nation and see what we're about. I think that's probably going to be the key, is just to be open and maybe go see what that tribe is. wherever you're at in the United States, that was Indian land. So go learn about where that tribe is, where they're at now. A lot of them probably have been moved to Oklahoma or someplace else. Maybe they're not in existence. We had so many tribes that were lost. And so maybe just go look and learn about the area around you.
Okay, thank you. Alex?
I think it's important to just reflect a little bit and acknowledge, as Miko said, and I mean that for each of us who are in our own, we have to, do these things in our own capacity. I used to be an administrator at our institution, and I realized how difficult it is to change an administration, even a new one like ours, right? My colleague at Spelman College would say, changing a university is like trying to turn a ship in a harbor. It is near impossible. It can be done, but sometimes you just got to blow up the harbor and try and reconstruct around it, right? Some of us, however, are instructors. We're teachers, we're lecturers, we're professors. And I think, the idea of acknowledging is really important. And one of the things that we're trying here is, trying to introduce an introductory course for first-year students where we actually talk about and acknowledge some of the institutional structures that work against them, right? And just say, hey, look, it's not you and the way that you talk. It is that we are short-sighted as an institution, and we do not value some of these things that absolutely should be valued, right? Yeah, and sometimes it starts with that individual student and building a relationship with an individual, because some of our students, if we lose them for a generation. We won't see them back again until their kids are in college. And so it's important to make those investments. Now, unfortunately, those investments are often made by women faculty and faculty of color, right? Because we're the ones who kind of bear the mantle, and a lot of us do it because when we reflect on who we are as individuals, we realize that that's something that's important to us. And it has to be important to a lot of people. And so I think starting with our students, who, if you're faculty out there, then that's important. The other thing too, is to get people who think that way, who think this way, the way that Lindsay does and Nico does, to get them in positions of power where they make decisions, right? Who can hire faculty that understand, who have awareness of local conditions and local students. It's not by accident, for example, that the whole movement and the involvement of UT Rio Grande Valley, or UTPA at the time, was done by its president, Miguel Nevares, who himself was Hispanic. And he really pushed this idea. And so, getting more people of color in positions of power is a start. And, maybe that is my student, that's the next one. And so I want to make sure that they are aware of their own assets and how they can get to where they're going. And that's my goal as an instructor.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you, Alex. Lindsay, please. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to answer a couple of questions in the live chat. One, I know Shortlet Amons put out a great PDF about 10 steps that so many acronyms, 10 steps that PWIs can do right now to create social change. To 10 concrete policy changes PWIs can enact to show Black Lives Matter. And some of these were like pay Black athletes, establish and fund Black cultural centers, support and promote Black faculty, fund research on Black issues, raise the profile of scholarship, strengthen Black studies programs, focus on equity and justice. And there's more on the list. And also the 10th one was create a reparations committee. So I think someone asked directly in the chat, people doing research on reparations within extension. And so I would point to the work of Shortlet Amons in North Carolina. And I would say to really understand that our land grant system was born in white supremacy, true, but it was also born in anti-Blackness. It was a direct result of fear and unwanting to engage and to educate and to grow and learn with specifically Black people. So I think if I could wave my wand, I'd really encourage people to read this Rupert Seals book. I think it's almost out of print. So I think that's a shame. So if you have could do anything about that, do something about that. If I don't know how far this magical wand goes, but I don't think that this book should be out of print or nearly out of print, for one. For two, I really think you should read the book if that's something that, and I wouldn't just advocate books, because I think that just advocating the written word can be also a tool of white supremacy. But I think that there's really, this man took his life and put his scholarship into telling the story so that it would live on beyond him. So I think that that is a concrete step. And then I think it's one, to educate yourself on white supremacy, but it's another to educate yourself on anti-Blackness. So that way you won't view 1890s, 1994s and Husekos as competing with each other, or that so there won't be infighting within those institutions, so that we can really have an appreciation and an understanding of how we all came to be in this land grant context. And anyone can be anti-Black. And a lot of people are, even Black people. So I think that we have to educate ourselves, read the disparity book, one, educate yourself as much as you can on not just white supremacy as in like what you're typically viewed of it as, but the way it actually proliferates in organizations. I think there's a great link article about called White Supremacy Culture in the Workplace by Tecum. I won't say the last name right now because I don't want to misquote it. So you can understand like how you're perpetuating it in your work emails and the type of meetings that you hold and the way that you show up in the world. And then third, educate yourself on what anti-Blackness is so that you can be a better advocate for the change that you're saying you want to see.
Thank you, Lindsay. And Rich, if you would share your perspective as well, and then Rich is gonna give us some final comments as we close out the conversation for today. And as he does that, I'll also ask Rich if you'll do the thank you, since I'm gonna pass the closing to you.
Thanks, Renee. And what Alex and Miko and Lindsay, to me, they spoke truth to power. What on that question? What I would just add, particularly for my colleagues that are still on the webinar that identify as white, is one other thing that they could do in addition to what you've all heard there. Is can you put yourself in some spaces where the majority of people that you're having conversation with, the vast majority of them are not white? Can you put yourselves in situations where you're in that minority and you're having a chance to be part of a conversation where that's very different than what normally happens at an 1862, whether you're a leader or you're out in the field in extension or you're a researcher or a teacher. Try to put yourself in those situations more often and try to listen before you speak. So with that, I want to thank all of our panelists. As Renee mentioned, we had, I think, two very vibrant conversations as we brought Alex into the conversation for this webinar with both Lindsay and Miko and Renee and I. And that was, I think, helpful for us to have a more honest and authentic conversation today. The webinar here is recorded and is being recorded now, and it's going to be available along with the associated slides we used to all the webinar registrants. And part of the funding here comes for this work comes from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. For those of you that are interested in the racial equity in the food system group, of which currently Renee and Lindsay and Miko are part of, there's a link here. We'll make sure that that also gets out when we send out the recording and the slides. Just to end here, the next step for our racial equity food system work group committee is we're learning. We're wanting to use the ideas and insights from webinars like this to build our future learning experiences. And as we've said here about building relationships at the speed of trust, several of our members on refs who were not presenting today, who have been at other institutions other than 1862s, are saying, why should I be part of something that involves an 1862, especially if they're in the lead? Why should I be part of that? It's a really important question I think we have to ask ourselves if we are with those institutions. And then, can we lift up more examples of partnerships that are authentic, pluralistic, or power sharing, and that are not dominated by white-led institutions? We've did a webinar before on the Wikini Initiative in South Dakota State University. Miko, I just learned in the last month there's there's an initiative starting at Ohio State University that is starting to talk about reparations with all the tribes from the land that was stolen to form Ohio State University. I have a contact there if anybody's interested in that. We've got to have more examples we can lift up, as well as understanding the historical disparity. How do we appreciate and work with the assets, and how do we find some examples that give us some hope? So with that, Renee, thank you so much for your eloquent and passionate facilitation. Kudos to you, and you are the part of the spirit and energy that keeps our group together. Thank you. And Lindsay, Miko, and Alex, thank you for letting me be here with you.
Yes. And thanks for all of our wonderful participants today. I just put a note in the chat that there were a lot of amazing questions. Many of them were combined to try to answer as many as possible. And those that were not, we'll pass those along to our panelists.
Yes.
And stay in touch with us via our listserv, as well as our website, to look for responses to those to the best of our ability. And again, thank you.